Hello and welcome back to World Talks. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. 15 countries are ready to move forward on security guarantees for Ukraine, and EU wants to cut regulations on weapon makers to help to boost production. These are the main takeaways of the E5 defense ministers meeting in Paris yesterday. At the same time, Polish President Andrzej Duda calls on the EU to raise the bar for defense spending up to 3% GDP, calling it necessary since there's no time for discussion, and wants to move the US nuclear warheads to Poland. To discuss the dynamic defense situation in Europe following the talks in Jeddah, we are now joined by Roland Freudenstein, speaker, writer and researcher, senior associate fellow at GLOBSEC, specialist on European integration and international security. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining.
Good morning, Anna. Good morning.
So yesterday, the E5 defense ministers met in Paris. Sébastien Lecornu, the French minister on defense, wants the defense industry not to be treated as any other industry. We want to cut the red tape, he says, within the EU regulations and national laws that could hinder or slow down the arms production. So does it mean that Europe is rearming itself to the teeth?
Rearming, yes, to the teeth remains to be seen. So, all the good intentions are there and the urgency is there, but this will not be done overnight. We're at the beginning of a process. And of course, we're going to, referring to the statement of Sébastien Lecornu that you referred to, we're going to have the old debates among the Europeans about the state, about the economy, about distribution of burdens between the member states and so on. And let's not forget, it's not just the EU in this game. Britain is a decisive partner in the E5 initiative, the five biggest spenders on defense in Europe. And Britain is an indispensable part of the answer to Russia's aggression in Ukraine and how to bring about a ceasefire and a peace.
Exactly. British Defence Minister John Healey says Britain will spend £4.5 billion in military aid for Ukraine only this year. So how can this whole be organized? Under which umbrella? EU plus the UK, plus the other coalition of the willing, like Turkey, for instance? How do you imagine this?
I think we're looking at the emergence of a three-tier system. So in the driver's seat, we have Europe's two nuclear powers, Britain and France. And that already transcends the borders of the European Union. So Britain and France were the two countries that immediately reacted to the transatlantic crisis in the wake of the Oval Office spat between Trump and Zelensky. Britain and France are in the driver's seat when it comes to somehow shaping Europe's help for Ukraine here. And then you have the E5 group, which is the five biggest spenders on defense. And that is Britain, France, of course, Poland, Germany, and Italy. And below that, you have those 15 countries, most of whom are EU member states, but not all, as you said, that are willing to contribute to a peacekeeping, a security guarantee operation for Ukraine after a ceasefire. So these are the three levels that we're acting on right now.
And we have the US. The Italian defense minister stated that nothing can happen without the US. Does this indicate a lack of unity in Europe?
No, that's got nothing to do with unity. Actually, I think the Europeans are pretty unified on this idea that with the force levels that you have and the force structures that you have in Europe today, a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, which will be manned and executed by European countries, only makes sense with a so-called US backstop. Now, what the backstop exactly is, that varies still, but it will certainly entail a large deal of provision of intelligence, including satellite imagery. It will have to entail air transport capacities that Europe just doesn't have, no European country has. And it will also entail air defense capacities, where the US have to directly help the Europeans keep the peace in Ukraine. Now, is the US going to give any security guarantee on top of this? That's still being debated. For example, if European troops are attacked by Russia in Ukraine, would the US ultimately provide a security guarantee for those European troops? Big question mark. I think, again, we have unity among the Europeans that this should be part of a deal. But this is what we're talking about right now.
All right, so now let's turn to the nuclear, if I may. Polish President Andrzej Duda underlines the importance of NATO component, of course, in the European defense. However, he's called on the US to extend its nuclear umbrella over Europe, specifically over Poland. So what could that mean in practice, you think? What could the US response could be?
Okay, wait a minute, Anna. The nuclear shield, the nuclear umbrella of the United States is already over Europe. At least it's supposed to be there. This is Article 5. You know, NATO has this mutual security obligation of member states. And in the case of America, that, of course, entails so-called extended deterrence. That means that the US will protect its European allies, including as the ultimate ratio, the use of nuclear weapons. Now, what President Duda was talking about, actually, was something that hasn't been mentioned for the first time, which is to actually deploy US nuclear weapons in Poland.
Exactly, the warheads.
Which is something that was, that's right, something that was painstakingly avoided after NATO enlargement in 1999 and 2004, Eastern enlargement, simply in order to appease Russia still at the time. But today, I mean, there are probably good reasons to think about the deployment of nuclear weapons, if only to actually strengthen transatlantic security guarantees, which have actually been put into doubt after November 6th and after the rhetoric of President Trump in the recent months.
So how should we exactly understand this request? Should it be like a symbolic request to place the warheads in Poland just to underline the commitment of the United States?
You just said it. It's the same thing that actually the French have brought into play vis-a-vis Germany. You know, there is a debate in Germany now, suddenly, whether Germany shouldn't develop its own nuclear weapons program. Now, first of all, these things are hellishly expensive. Second, they would take a very, very long time to become effective. And third, of course, about Germany, a lot of people are still questioning whether Germany should have nuclear weapons at all. So the French proposal ad hoc was that why don't we put a couple of our nuclear capable bombers of the French Air Force into German airfields in order to achieve exactly this kind of symbolic effect. And nothing else than that has been at the base of the idea voiced now by President Duda.
All right. So looking at the developments after the Jeddah talks right now, how do you predict the US-Russia ceasefire negotiations might unfold?
Well, there are US-Ukraine-Russia negotiations in a way. At least
Yes.
Ukraine did score some success 2 days ago by getting the US back on its side when it comes to provision of intelligence and military hardware. So, you know, the ball is in Russia's court. Everybody is repeating this right now. How is Russia going to react? My prediction is this. Putin is not going to say no. Putin is also not going to say yes. Putin will say maybe. under certain conditions. And that is where he will try to bring onto the table as much as possible of the classical Russian demands that have been around for more than 3 years for peace in Ukraine, which are not just territorial recognition of Russian territorial annexations in Ukraine, not just Ukrainian neutrality, i.e. no NATO membership, but also de facto regime change in Kyiv. Also the demilitarization, i.e. the very, very strong reduction of Ukrainian military forces, and of course, no NATO on Ukrainian soil, plus the lifting of sanctions, no post-war justice for any Russian war criminals, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I think the Russians will say, yes, but consider this and that point of our strategic agenda. And the fear is that this might actually fall on positive ears in Washington, and that after now having threatened Putin with sanctions and lowering the oil price and so on, that Trump would then once again turn to bullying the Ukrainians and particularly Zelensky.
I think there's a common understanding right now that these peace talks are not only about the situation on the front and ceasing the fire, but it's about the security architecture in Europe, especially in eastern part of the continent. So what should be the red lines from the security point of view of European Union that should not be crossed?
Well, the most important thing is that Ukraine, and territorially most of Ukraine, remains a free country. That Ukraine remains a democracy that takes its own decisions about its foreign policy, its basic orientation, the way it shapes its economy, and so on. So in other words, Russia wants to make Ukraine a weak, corrupt kleptocracy ruled by some Russia-friendly authoritarian ruler. That's Putin's plan, and ultimately he wants to swallow at least half of the country and ultimately dominate the entire country, because he wants to abolish Ukraine as a state, and certainly abolish Ukraine as a free nation. So to safeguard this is our security interest.
All right, and if Trump decides to push Zelensky into an unfavorable deal, we can imagine what the possible consequences for Ukraine and Europe could be, but how might European leaders respond if Trump tries to negotiate a quick deal that benefits Russia?
I think Europe's only choice is to do what Macron and Starmer have fairly successfully done 2 weeks ago in Washington with their visits. It is to actually to convince Trump it's in the US interest to work with the Europeans and maintain Ukraine as a free country.
All right. So fingers crossed then. Thank you so much, Roland Freudenstein, co-founder Brussels Freedom Hub, GLOBSEC Associate Fellow, was our guest this morning. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes this edition of World Talk, but please stay tuned to TVP World for more.